Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was born on November the 30th, 1874, and died on January the 24th, 1965. Lol. Most well known, and still widely revered in the UK for his role in leading Britain through the Second World War, and there's no doubt that defeating Nazism was the high point of his career, albeit that he wasn't really a military man, he was just good at, rousing the country, so there's that. Anyway, but besides that high point, there was a lot of shithousery before, during, and after from old Winnie. After his imperialist jaunts of his youth in Cuba, India, Sudan, and South Africa from 1895 to 1900, during which time he literally fired upon even Cuban independence revolutionaries and stuff on behalf of the Spanish crown. Nationalists. Anyway, he would return to Britain and become a politician, flip-flopping between the Conservative and Liberal parties on a couple of occasions during the course of his career. In 1910, as Home Secretary, Churchill will send British troops to quell the protests of striking miners in the Welsh town of Tonopandi. Yes, he sent armed forces against British citizens. Land of hope and glory indeed. Speaking of his reckless and disgusting use of British armed personnel, Churchill would lead the Gallipoli campaign during the First World War, which was an utter fucking disaster, resulting in the needless slaughter of 90,000 men for no benefit to anyone. What a fucking tool. By the way, that would mirror his soft underbelly approach to the invasion of Italy during the Second World War. He was a fucking disaster who should never have been in charge of any military affairs. Anyway. After the Gallipoli campaign, he was sacked from the government and a period of backbench obscurity before he returned in the 1920s to fuck things up again. This time only financially, though. As Chancellor of the Exchequer, he took the super big-brained galactic idea of returning Britain to the gold standard, resulting in financial catastrophe, just in time for the Great Depression as well. Thanks, Win! In 1927, he met with Benito Mussolini and praised the Italian fascist leader because, can anyone hazard a guess as to why? It's because he was an anti-communist. Well, I'm glad that particular liberal fascist bargain didn't come back to haunt the entirety of the world in the largest and most destructive war ever fought by humanity, because if that had happened, it would have made Churchill's chumminess with Mussolini seem maybe like he wasn't the ever-firm opponent of fascist tyranny that saw it all coming down the line, as his dick-sucking hagiographers would portray him as. And in addition to all of this, Churchill was a massive fucking racist. Churchill was the archetypal liberal imperialist, that being seeing the British Empire as a civilising force. Very much a kind of white man's burden, which as always is a cover from far more fucking sinister beliefs. Indeed, Churchill himself described his reason for opposing self-rule in the colonies in the Empire as, quote, being good for the primitive and subject races. And I have to just stop here and say, content warning, racial slurs incoming. Just saying. No N-words though. I did screen for that. Anyway, like I said, the white man's burden shit is always a cover for racial supremacist shithousery, with old churchy poops stating back in 1902 that, quote, barbaric nations would menace civilised nations, and, quote, the Aryan stock is bound to triumph, unquote. Which is a little less white man's burden altruism and more Daily Stormer genocidal lunacy. And in terms of his various racist views on any number of different groups of people, it would be impossible to go into depth with all of them, as it would be we'd be here all fucking night, given the sheer breadth and depth of his many and varied bigotries. So I'll just give you a brief trip around the globe to visit his hotspots of racial animus. He was no fan of the people of Iraq, or Mesopotamia as it was known at the time, when in 1920 he said, referring to British colonial forces' use of chemical weapons on Iraqi civilians, quote, I do not understand this squeamishness about the use of gas. I am strongly in favour of using poisoned gas against uncivilised tribes, end quote.
Jesus.
Moving on to Palestine/Israel, when discussing the situation there, he referenced, Jesus, my notes are bad here, various of his hatreds in one particularly illuminating verbal deposition before the Peel Commission in 1937. Quote, I do not admit that the dog in the manger has the final right to the manger. Though he may have lain there for a very long time, I do not admit that right. I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to those people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, or at any at any rate a more worldly wise race, have taken their place. Now, that is of course horrific racism against Palestinians, American Indians and the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, but at least it means he's not anti-Semitic, right? Well, no, of course he was fucking anti-Semitic as well. And a firm proponent of the Nazi bullshit known as Jewish Bolshevism. Stating in the 1920s, quote, "There is no need to exaggerate the part played in the creation of Bolshevism and in the actual bringing about of a Russian Revolution by those international and for the most part atheistical Jews. It is certainly a very great one. It probably outweighs all others. With the most notable exception of Lenin, the majority of the leading figures are Jews, or moreover, the principal inspiration and driving power comes from the Jewish leaders." Unquote. Which was, of course, not just incorrect, but indeed the foundational idea of much of 20th century Western anti-Semitism. What a fucking douchebag. Churchill also hated the Irish, and it was he who sent, as Secretary of War in 1920, sent the infamous Black and Tans to the north of that country to wreak terroristic havoc on the Catholic and Republican population, and that was, as already mentioned, not the first time he had sent armed forces against civilians. He was also very racist towards the Chinese, stating, and get ready for this one, it's a doozy, quote, "I hate people with slit eyes and pigtails. I don't like the look of them or the smell of them." Unquote.
Oh, God.
What a charming fellow he was. And finally, and probably most famously, Churchill was no fan of the inhabitants of India. According to Secretary of State for India at the time, Leo Amory, Churchill, quote, "hated Indians and considered them, quote, a beastly people with a beastly religion." In 1943, Churchill helped vastly exacerbate the Bengal famine, which killed between 3 and 4 million people, and when informed that his policies were causing this human catastrophe, he quipped that any relief efforts were bound to fail as the Indians, quote, "bred like rabbits," unquote. When given a report on the enormous loss of life in Bengal, instead of actually giving a shit, he merely wrote in the margin of the documents, "Why couldn't it have been Gandhi?" referencing his hatred for the Indian liberation hero Mohandas, or Mahatma, Gandhi. And it's surely one of the great pieces of historical trolling that alongside Churchill's statue in Parliament Square is a statue of Gandhi, the man he absolutely hated. Top-rate historical trolling. Fucking love it. Here endeth the sermon.